Hello. I would like to take a moment before I begin my paper to just thank my fellow panelists as well as the coordinators of our section. I sincerely appreciate your efforts to include me in a virtual presentation of my paper. My paper is entitled The Anglophone Caribbean Diaspora and Catholic Expression in the African Orthodox Church. Daniel William Alexander, the Archbishop and Primate of the African Orthodox Church, was one of a small number of black clergy who found and led their own church in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century. My current book project, Kingdoms of the Earth, Daniel Williams Alexander and the Rise of the Black Church in South Africa, is a biography of Alexander. In the manuscript, I draw on the methodological strengths of my discipline, history, to reconstruct Alexander's life in order to illuminate the ways in which racial identity, state control, and religious beliefs intersected in pre-apartheid South Africa. His life offers us a lens into the broader forces that structured South African society before the institutionalization of apartheid in 1948. I would like to use my paper today as an opportunity to present a version of one chapter of Kingdoms of the Earth, in which I trace the Church's connections to the old Catholic movement in North America. In it, I introduce some of the key figures that established and ensured apostolic succession in the Anglo-Catholic body. Today's paper is largely organized around the church founder, Reverend George Maguire, and Bishop Joseph Rene Vilate, who bestowed Maguire with the episcopacy. I examine Vilate and the surprising role this Parisian-born priest played in granting the African Orthodox Church apostolic succession, despite the Church's controversial association with the Universal Negro Improvement Association and its version of black nationalism. Beyond recounting this curious story, this paper strives to consider the ways in which Vilate's experiences of cultural and religious border crossing influenced his support of churches, whose perspective often fell on the religious margins. I suggest that the Vilate's circuitous journey to become an old Catholic bishop rendered him a religious and cultural outsider, giving him the ability to look beyond race and politics to support leaders like Maguire, whose doctrinal, ecclesiastical hierarchies, and cultural experiences mirrored his own. In this paper, I unpack this unusual connection between Vilate, a European bishop of the Old Catholic Church, and Maguire, a British West Indian black nationalist, to delineate the ways in which religious migration and ethnic migration fuel a certain type of religious creativity for immigrants in their new homes. Maguire founded the African Orthodox Church in 1919 with the help of British West Indian immigrants in New York who had defected from the Roman Catholic and Anglican Church. The Church's Anglo-Catholic roots meant that the apostolic succession would be a critical feature of the new religious body. Maguire sought the episcopacy shortly after he became the leader of the African Orthodox Church, and Vilate was the only one willing to honor it. Although Vilate was the leader and founder of the Old Catholic movement in North America, his flock had waned considerably by the turn of the century, and he had cast all of his efforts into transferring the episcopacy to a variety of religious bodies. Vilate granted Maguire the position of bishop toward the end of his clerical career in 1921. By that time, Vilate had not only lived in Europe, North America, and South Asia, but he had also taken up callings among Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and Roman Catholics, all while establishing the American Old Catholic Church in the United States. His denominational crisscrossing gave him clarity about the distinction between spirituality and religious institutionalization. It also solidified his allegiance to a form of independent Catholicism that questioned papal authority, championed the episcopate, and found full communion in the Union of Utrecht of old Catholic churches as well as the Anglicans. These doctrinal views were wildly uncommon, and it limited his ability to grow his church. Instead, His legacy was granting apostolic succession to various bishops throughout the country and throughout the world. McGuire benefited from Volate's commitment to the episcopacy because the old Catholic bishop drew from a cadre of doctrinal and cultural experiences, making the African Orthodox Church a legible religious institution. Had Volate not had such exposure, he might have rejected McGuire's request for consecration. The African Orthodox Church has been framed almost exclusively as simply a religious offshoot of Marcus Garvey's Black nationalist movement. For many scholars of the African Orthodox Church, its entanglement with politics often erased its religiosity, and very rarely is its religious history fully explored, especially in relationship to Catholicism. The Church was an autonomous Anglo-Catholic body that catered to Black Christians. It was, quote, imbued with the Catholic doctrinal principles, animated by a sacramental piety and loyalty to a ministry grounded in the apostolic succession, end quote. Its Anglican and Catholic traditions were carried to America by the Church's West Indian clergy, who, like their followers, migrated from throughout the British West Indies and Latin America, finally settling in North America. Despite these multiple migrations, many West Indians retained the faith they had cultivated on the islands from which they came. When British West Indian immigrants first arrived in New York, they sought out their Catholic and Anglican congregations. However, there were very few African American Anglicans and much less Catholics. When British West Indian immigrants could attend their respective churches, whether they were Black or white congregations, they were often met with racial and ethnic hostility. Their experiences often left West Indians feeling cut off from genuine Christian fellowship. As an alternative to these hostile religious spaces, West Indian immigrants created the African Orthodox Church. The Church, however, was not just a racial or ethnic institution parallel to the Episcopalian or Catholic Church. While the Church preserved its high church ethos, it was most certainly a product of Anglophone Caribbean migration and religious creativity. In the religious realm, West Indian immigrants had carried with them a unique set of beliefs and practices from their home islands, all of which they used to create spaces of spiritual and cultural belonging. Additionally, I might add that there are a number of political practices that they turned into sort of the liturgical practices throughout their church services. Careful examination of these churches will contribute to a more expansive understanding of Black worship in America. Furthermore, when thinking through its relationship to independent Catholicism, it foregrounds the complexities of Catholic expression when race, ethnicity, and migration are part of the story. As products of religious migration, the African Orthodox Church, among other churches supported by West Indian immigrants, brought Caribbean theologies to the forefront of American religious life. Anglicanism was typically the theological bedrock of this expression among British West Indians. Immigrants not only transplanted Anglicanism, but they cultivated their own religious leadership and established their own institutions in multiple regions. The African Orthodox Church is a part of this migration story, making them part not only of a religious or ethnic diaspora, but making them part of not only a racial or ethnic diaspora, but a religious one, quote, evocative of an uprooted and regathered religious community, end quote. And while there certainly were West Indians who were Catholic, this religious inflection was really re-energized in the life of the African Orthodox Church when McGuire had to lean on Volate for the episcopacy. Volate was preparing to return to Europe when McGuire petitioned him for the episcopacy. The old Catholic leader was Parisian-born, as I mentioned, but he was raised in a non-papal Catholic church called the Petite Église. However, he trained for his priesthood under the Roman Catholic Church while still remaining faithful to the tenets of his ecclesiastical upbringing. In fact, during his studies, Volate was influenced by Father Charles Chiquini, a former Roman Catholic priest and an outspoken dissenter of the church, who shared many of Volate's views of the Roman Catholic Church. As he learned from his mentor, Volate grappled with his faith, citing that, quote, "My mind was much disturbed because I saw plainly that while on the one hand Romanism had added much error and corruption to the primitive faith, Protestantism had not only taken away Roman errors, but was also part of the primitive deposit of faith," end quote. He also suggested that, quote, "the teaching of the seminary was so rabidly Romanist that all other beliefs were condemned as heresies," end quote, making him seriously examine Catholicism as a whole. During this period of reflection, his mentor introduced him to Old Catholicism. Shortly after training in Canada, where he had been mentored, he was consecrated in Switzerland. Volate moved to the American Midwest, where he trained to minister Belgian immigrants in Wisconsin as a Presbyterian minister. Unfortunately, there are no records to suggest why he became affiliated with the Presbyterian Church. However, what did become clear to Volate was that Belgian immigrants with Catholic roots had no interest in Calvinism. He believed, however, that the old Catholic movement would be something more easily received and accessible by Belgian Catholics. In a short time, this church was, quote, "crowded to suffocation," end quote. These immigrants, among others, had been attracted to the ways Volate catered to their settlers' spiritual and national preferences. It was during this period that Volate began to think about the importance of culture and nationalism during religious expression. This attention to culture and ethnicity would serve him well as he developed the church in Wisconsin. In fact, he was able to create a satellite congregation several miles from his original station because he relied on these tools to lure Roman Catholics away from their parishes in Green Bay. He incited so much chaos for the Roman Catholics that the presiding bishop, Fred Katzer, not only excommunicated him, but also wrote his new parishioners a letter. The Roman Catholic bishop wrote, quote, "Your bishop learned the wrong way, the way that lends to perdition," end quote. The bishop continued, quote, "You ought to know your holy religion better than to be deluded and seduced by a man who within the space of a few years has professed 3 or 4 kinds of religion. You ought to esteem the faith of your ancestors higher than to sacrifice it for such a farce. For this old Catholicism, or Christian Catholicism, is but the latest religious farce," end quote. He closed the letter stating emphatically, end quote, quote, "Therefore, there is but one Catholicism, the Roman one, the true one. A Catholic who falls away from his church cannot be saved. You will find out. Oh, but no, I hope you will return before you find out," end quote. The parishioners never yielded to Katzer's warning. Most of Volate's parishioners were enthralled in his charisma and dynamism. These characteristics, alongside a weak church structure, meant that the church developed around Volate. In other words, the growth of Old Catholicism, at least at this juncture in North America, was very much limited to its leaders' movements. And Volate not only recognized his limitations, but also recognized that he needed the episcopacy to sustain the authority of this church. In fact, his own standing came to questions when parishioners found out that Volate had never been consecrated. Some called him, quote, "an impostor sent by the enemies of the church to destroy the work of God and scatter the flock of God," end quote. Without the episcopacy, Old Catholics were further alienated from mainstream Catholic churches, not to mention that it undermined one of their core tenets, apostolic succession. So Volate began to seek it wherever he might be welcomed, from the Episcopal Church to the Russian Orthodox Church. But to his chagrin, his request was largely rejected even from the old Catholic movement in Europe. Eventually, Volate made contact with Father Alvarez, of the independent Catholic Church, the Jacobite Church of Ceylon, and in India. The leader of the church agreed to consecrate Volate. For 1 full year, Volate left his missions in the care of another church leader and lived in South Asia awaiting his consecration. Volate was very wary of consecrating the, quote, freelance French priest, end quote. But finally, he agreed to grant him the episcopacy at the turn of the 20th century. I imagine his commitment to gaining the episcopacy and staying in South Asia was part of Father Alvarez's motivations for eventually consecrating him. Almost 20 years later, Maguire sought the episcopacy from Volate. I suspect that Volate very likely reflected on his own troubles of attaining it when Maguire intimated that he had requested it from the Episcopalians and the Russian Orthodox Church, only to be rejected like Volate had been 20 years prior. At the time of Maguire's request for apostolic succession, Volate was more or less a roving bishop without a flock to shepherd. He kept himself busy traveling from Green Bay to Chicago, as well as Canada and even Mexico. He granted the episcopacy to well over 20 bishops during that period. However, shortly after he bestowed the episcopacy to the African Orthodox Church, he ended his career by succumbing to the power of the Roman Catholic Church, eventually seeking an alliance with them. I imagine that not having a religious space and home base actually motivated Volate to return to the Roman Catholic Church and eventually actually to pass away at the Vatican. This seemingly strange connection between Volate and Maguire, as well as larger connections between the American Old Catholic Church and the African Orthodox Church, speak to the way religious migration and ethnic migration fuel a certain type of religious creativity for immigrants in their new homes. Oftentimes, this creativity and the subsequent building of a formal religious body was motivated by a strong desire of religious and cultural belonging, but also for familiarity. This desire for belonging was witnessed during Volate's ministry among the Belgian Catholics and similarly among Maguire and West Indian immigrants. It raises questions about the ways in which Catholic ritual and philosophy found new forms of expression when immigrants tried to forge new lives and experience freedom that extended beyond their old oppressive political and economic systems and into the church itself. Thank you very much for affording me this opportunity to share my work.